Chop and drop is a concept from permaculture. Permaculture is a kind of agriculture that produces food sustainably. The idea of creating a permaculture farm or a permaculture garden is that you get it going and then it functions like a self-sustaining ecosystem and produces food with very little effort over time. That's their concept. And one of the ideas that they have is chop and drop, which just means that you chop the leaves and stems off some plants and put them around other plants as a mulch. Some plants in permaculture are grown just for the purpose of cutting the leaves off and putting them around other plants. So especially plants like comfrey that will, even if you chop it off, it's like lettuce. You chop it off and it keeps growing more leaves. Like you don't kill it if you chop it off. So, and comfrey apparently has really deep roots that go down below the topsoil and pull up minerals into their leaves, and then you chop it off, you throw it around as mulch for another plant, those decompose and the minerals become available to that plant. So that's the idea of chop and drop. One of the advantages of doing this is that if you have earthworms, it feeds the earthworms and they will come up, because the way earthworms feed on decaying organic matter like leaves, and they actually come up out of the ground at night and grab leaves and pull them down into their hole and chew them up. And then when they crawl down into their holes, they're pooping and they're basically fertilizing your plants from below. So although you're putting the chop and drop around the outside surface of the plant, those nutrients make their way down into the soil in other ways too. Even if you don't have earthworms, fungus and bacteria break down those leaves, and then when it rains, the water washes those nutrients down into the plant, and those become available to the plant that you've put this stuff around. It also helps keep in moisture when you have mulch around a plant. I saw a demonstration by Alan Savory where he had 3 plots of bare ground that he'd marked out. He had one he just left as bare ground, one that he just covered with straw, and one that he covered with straw and then hit with a stick. He was trying to demonstrate what cattle do in a grassland to keep it alive and thriving. And then he just poured a same amount, 1 pitcher of water on each spot, and then came back several hours later. So several hours later, the stuff has been sitting in the sun. The bare ground was bone dry, and that's part of the problem with bare ground is that the water a lot of times the bare ground gets kind of a hard crust on it, so the water doesn't even go in, it runs off. But even if it does go in, it's open and bare, and the sun beats down on it and it just evaporates right back into the air. So it doesn't really do the plants any good if it's a light rain, for example. And then he uncovered the spot that just had the straw on it, mulch, and it was still moist. And then the one that had been hit with the stick was even more moist because he had broken up the surface. So if it had formed a crust, which apparently it did, then the hard crust makes the water run off. But in this case, because he broke it up, more of it soaked in. And then because of the mulch, more of it stayed in and didn't evaporate. So that's one of the advantages of putting chop and drop around a plant is it keeps when it does rain, it keeps that moisture from evaporating. It also cools the roots. I saw another demonstration, I think it was also a permaculture guy, he tested the temperature of bare soil, and then right next to it, he had a pile of mulch, and he pushed aside the mulch and then tested the temperature of the soil there under the mulch, and it was like 15 degrees cooler. So if you're in a hot area or a place that gets really hot in the summer, if you got chop and drop around your plant, it can really help the plant stay cooler. Some plants, if their roots are fairly close to the surface, so if it gets too hot, it kills off those roots that are close to the surface. So it kind of damages and stresses the plant, but if you got chop and drop around it or mulch around it, it can help keep that cooler and moister, and the plant isn't as stressed when it gets really hot. One of the advantages of feeding earthworms by throwing this chop and drop around a plant is that the earthworms, because they make holes, they kind of break up the soil in that way. They allow more water to penetrate when it does rain. So the water goes down deep. Sometimes these earthworm tunnels go really deep because they try to stay in moist where it's moist, And if it's drying out because it's summer, they'll just go deeper. So sometimes their tunnels, and they reuse their tunnels. Sometimes their tunnels go pretty deep. So this allows that water to really penetrate down. They also, because the way they digest their food inside an earthworm, they break it down using bacteria, basically probiotics for the soil. So when they poop out their waste, it's not only fertilizer, broken down organic material, but it's also full of bacteria that are good for the plants that you're trying to feed. Earthworms are a surprisingly interesting topic. There's a really good book on it called The Earth Moved by Amy Stewart. One of the things I found out is that the last thing that Charles Darwin was studying in his life was earthworms. I think he even wrote a book about them. One of the things he did, I think it was the thing that actually got him interested in it in the first place, is he noticed that there were some ruins in the English countryside by near his house. And he noticed that he was like, when I was a kid, those ruins were not quite that buried. In other words, over his lifetime, 50 years or whatever, those ruins had sunk in the ground a little bit. And he started wondering how that is happening. And his guess was that it was earthworms, that as they till the soil, they're bringing dirt up to the surface because they have to dig those tunnels, right? So they're digging holes and they deposit some of that soil up on the surface. And he calculated how many possible earthworms there would be in a square acre or whatever, and how much soil each one of them would be bringing up. And he estimated that they would bury something so much, and when he actually measured it, that was about how much it buried it. So he predicted that we would find that wherever earthworms are, things would slowly sink into the ground, and he was right. But when we're talking about plants that you're trying to grow, earthworms can really do a lot of good. Not only do they dig these holes, make the water penetrate, they leave the fertilizer behind, and they leave the bacteria behind. But even if you don't have earthworms, and there's some places that don't have them. As a matter of fact, they're not even native to North America. Or actually, they were native to North America before the last ice age, but the last ice age killed them all off, and they've been reintroduced from the UK. But even if you don't have earthworms, the other microorganisms in the soil do a very similar job, breaking down the chop and drop that you put around the plant and making those nutrients available to the plant. Matter of fact, roughage, the indigestible fiber that represents, the leaves that you're putting as chop and drop, does as much good for your plants as it does for you. When you want to feed your microorganisms in your gut, you eat roughage. You eat indigestible material like greens and vegetables and fruits. I mean, you get the sugars out of the fruits, but there are indigestible parts of that fruit, like the pectin, that you don't directly digest, but bacteria inside your guts digest it and benefit you by being there. So indigestible plant material is good for both you and for your plants. It's good for the microbes that protect and feed you and those plants. When we come back, I'll explain why feeding the microbes in the soil is so good for the plant. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started. There's a really interesting book called I Contain Multitudes that talked about how we talk about, okay, so we have bacteria in our intestines, right? Which we think of as something that we've adapted. Our bodies have used these microbes. But this guy had a totally different view of microbes. He said, really, we evolved in a world of microbes, in the same way that we evolved in a world filled with oxygen. So we haven't really adapted to the oxygen. We've evolved in the oxygen. In the book, I Contain Multitudes, he says, okay, if you're going to take the entire age of the earth and put it into 1 year, So 4.5 billion years represented by 1 year of our time. Said, or sometime around March, single-celled organisms began. And it wasn't until October that anything other than single cells existed. So for by far the longer part of the history of Earth, the main living organisms on Earth were single-celled things, single-celled organisms. So when animals began to evolve, they were evolving on a planet dominated by single-celled organisms. And they exist throughout our whole bodies, on our skin, in our eyes, in our intestines. All throughout our bodies, we have single-celled organisms, and many more of them than we have cells of our own bodies. In the book, The Hidden Half of Nature, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, he says that those single-celled organisms, both on us and in us, outnumber our own cells by at least 3 to 1, and many say 10 to 1. And we have evolved to adapt to this situation, and many of those bacteria and fungus and other single-celled organisms have evolved to adapt to us. So we are in a symbiotic relationship. They help us and we help them, and the same with the plants. And how you feed these things, or one of the main ways that you feed these beneficial, protective, single-celled organisms, is by giving them chop and drop, or in your case, roughage as food. I mentioned the book earlier, The Hidden Half of Nature by David Montgomery and his wife, Anne Bickley. They talk in there about how they wanted to start a garden. David Montgomery he's a professor at the University of Washington. He lives in Seattle. And he wrote a really good book, another book, maybe I'll do a podcast on that one because it was fascinating, called Dirt. It was about how the history of civilizations has been driven by erosion, by our use of soil. But that's another story. So he and his wife, David Montgomery and his wife, bought a house in Seattle and wanted to put a garden in the back, and found out that the soil underneath a very thin layer of topsoil was this really hard, rocky surface that had been caused by the glaciers when they came down from Canada and just scrubbed this area. So it was really hard for roots to penetrate, which was a bummer for his wife, because she really wanted to start a garden. But they solved the problem they made raised beds, so give a little bit of distance, and then they started piling in organic matter, leaves and coffee grounds, and she would go around the neighborhood and gather up leaves that people were raking from their yards in the fall and pile that on there. And she'd go around, and the arborists in the area, when they cut down trees or trimmed branches or whatever, they chip it up into wood chips. She asked them to just give them to her, which saved them the cost of taking it to somewhere and paying to get rid of it. So they would just pile this stuff on their driveway, and then she'd carry it back into the back garden and put it on the raised beds. And he said in a few years, they had rich, productive soil, really good garden in there, just by piling on chop and drop, basically. Just organic material, just piled it on there, and just let the bacteria and the fungi and the nematodes and everything else that's in there go to town and turn it into rich, moist soil. Anyway, that's the concept of chop and drop. It's pretty simple. You just, if let's say you're pruning a tree, take the leaves off those and pile them up around something else. Don't, cutting your grass, take some of those leaves and pile them around a plant that you want to nurture. You'll be feeding those plants through the intermediary of microorganisms. So you're feeding the microorganisms and they're feeding your plant. Pretty simple. Probably I didn't need to make such a long podcast on such a simple concept, but I did. There you go. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.